one of the things that Lupovich talks about in his short piece on the Pale of Settlement is the idea of Hasidim or Hasidism, as well as Mitnagdim or Mitnagdism. So Hasidim, this is the Hebrew plural for Hasidic people. Um, and that's where we really want to start. So in the 18th century in particular, there's a spread of practices related to metaphysical religion. And so by this I mean thinking about new concepts of what the nature of the cosmos might be, as well as how people can have a direct experience of God. If textual study had been the basis of Judaism, of rabbinic Judaism, from really the first century to the 18th century, with of course varying levels of people actually having the means or the desire to participate in learning Jewish texts. In the 18th century, we see a movement that develops as kind of pushing back against text and textual study as a way of learning about Judaism. By this time, literacy was very, very high. The printing press had had a huge effect on what was possible to distribute, the amount of texts that people could own. There's an increase in texts that are available in translation, although many Jewish authorities are very wary of translation. And so Hasidism develops as a way of thinking about how to find God places or in practices besides textual study. So one of them is something that's called pantheism, an idea that God is in everything. So one can walk in the forest and through the trees and the butterflies, the magic floating in the air. One can really see and feel and experience directly a connection with God. But Hasidism also developed several other practices that were really even more controversial. One was a form of prayer where they tended to move their bodies back and forth wildly. So generally in Judaism, while people pray, they'll have a prayer book here, and they'll rock back and forth to the rhythm of the chanting the prayer. But Hasidism really took that to the next level, and it was encouraged and sometimes even described in highly erotic language. And that erotic language was connected to an idea of how humans interact with God, that Kabbalah in general has an idea of God having emanated a finite version of God's self in order to be able to create the human world, the material world. And so there's infinite God in God's self. That's a God that humans can't really know. It sort of addresses a question of how can humans who are finite know something about an infinite God. And even a more practical question, what should Jews be focusing on when they pray? That if I close my eyes and try to think of infinity, I can't picture it, right? And so this idea of God having created a materialish version of God's self, an emanated version is generally the language that's used, that's in this kind of intermediary realm between infinite God and human world, then that means that humans have something that they can really think about, and that it's not wrong, that however big, and their descriptions of God's body as being hundreds of thousands of miles long, that's huge. But I think that we have to see the language as always being metaphor, and as a way of thinking of finite distances that actually are so big that in a way they ask us to begin to think about what infinity is. So in addition to these controversial new descriptions of the cosmos and God, these highly physical prayers, this idea of textual study as not being necessary for everyone, in a lot of ways, this was very attractive to many Jews living in Eastern Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries, because it provided access to God as well as to Judaism by not having to study, right? Not everyone wants to study. Not you. You maybe love to study, maybe you don't. I don't know you. Right? But that it's not for everyone to spend 6, 9, 12, 16 hours a day poring over texts, asking legal questions about minutiae. For some people, this is extremely important and meaningful, and I'll talk about them in a second. But for others, those who chose to join the Hasidic movement, it's really it's controversial. And it's also a challenge to the authority of traditional Jewish communities. The traditional Jewish community is known as a kahal, K-A-H-A-L, and this includes a kind of board or a court of rabbis who make legal decisions. They have a certain amount of autonomy. And so Hasidism also included a new kind of charismatic perspective of certain leading rabbis who became known as tzaddikim, Tzaddikim, which means righteous ones, or in the long run they became known as rebbes, R-E-B-B-E. So with that new position, first of all, it had the idea that this is an extremely holy and charismatic person, that this person themselves is a kind of portal to God. And so just to be with them is a way of getting closer to God. And that individuals don't necessarily have to study Talmud and Torah, but rather the Rebbe will. The Rebbe will be an authority, and the Rebbe will simply tell people what they need to know as this kind of charismatic teacher. So what happens with Hasidism is that those charismatic figures develop into different dynasties, and often they're named for the cities where they come from. So two major ones are the Lubavitchers, who might be the most visible Hasidim that you would see in the U.S. If you think of people in black hats and black suits with these curly side locks that are called payas. Those could be a lot of different movements of Hasidic Jews or other ultra-Orthodox Jews, but they may well be Lubavitchers who are from Lubavitch. And the largest surviving group are the Satmar Hasidim, who are from Hungary, who survive in the largest numbers basically because the Holocaust hit Transylvania, this kind of borderland in between Hungary and Romania, very late. So more Jews survived because they weren't deported until 1944 from this group. And there's a very big group of them in the United States. They are opposed to the existence of the State of Israel. They continue practices that began in Eastern Europe. Of course, there's a lot of change in the United States, but some of these groups of Hasidim have legacies that continue to today, and so we have to look at what happened in Eastern Europe to see where they come from. The other group that Lubavitch mentions are the Mitnagdim. So basically the Mitnagdim continue and even kind of go the other way with textual study in a reaction to Hasidim. So Mitnagdim, or as the Hebrew would have been pronounced by Jews living in Eastern Europe, Misnagdim, this just means the opponents. And they're called that because they're the opponents of Hasidism. So they emphasize study even more. They develop what are called yeshivas, or institutions of Jewish higher learning. These exist in the United States too. There's a little bit more of a mix between Hasidim and Mitnagdim today, mainly because there just aren't that many ultra Orthodox Jews and they rely on each other. But in Eastern Europe, these were very separate practices and they were very different forms of order. That the Mitnagdim wanted a form of order in the Jewish community on the model of the Kahal, even after the Kahal became illegal and Jews were incorporated into the structures of the Russian government. Okay, so we have these two groups that develop, the Hasidim and the Mitnagdim, and these are the, let's say, sort of strictly observant Jews in Eastern Europe. But I think what we see in Lubavitch, in Nathan's, and in reading the literature of Sholem Aleichem is that there are really a lot of different models for how to be Jewish. So these are two really important movements, but they don't constitute everyone in Eastern Europe. Not everyone lives in a smaller city. Some are living in major cosmopolitan cities, but otherwise Jews are living in towns. For the most part, they're not living rural life. And in these places, they begin to just continue to think about, what does it mean to be Jewish? And how do we see these practices, whether they're Hasidim or Mitnagdim or members of the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, basically, they're asking questions about what form of government would be best for them. They're negotiating how to exist in the Russian Empire, but they're also imagining new futures. What form of government in the Russian Empire will best benefit the continued flourishing of Jewish life in Eastern Europe?